In the last video, we discussed the origins of both Western and Chinese thought as it bore on the question of government. Both start with a fear of disorder. The Westerners use the fear of disorder in order to make a statement about individual rights. The Chinese make a statement about disorder looking at the issue of a common good for everyone. We're going to take this another step farther and take a look at what this means. In the West, disorder leads to laws that prohibit the absolutely unacceptable behavior. Behaviors like murder, theft, assaults. These are terrible wrongs against the individual right of self-preservation. So they are punished through laws. However, the punishments are applied to human beings who also have a right of self-preservation. So this leads to rights that get expressed in the West that protect individuals who are in custody awaiting trial or in custody being confined as a part of their punishment. In the United States, this is expressed in the Eighth Amendment to of the Bill of Rights, which says there can be no cruel and unusual punishments. Why no cruel and unusual punishments? Well, because cruel and unusual punishments would be excessive and would be attacking the self-preservation rights of individuals. To carry the logic a little bit farther, if the government carries out extremely harsh penalties, torture against people, that's likely to lead to rebellions, which in the Western sense would be going against the kind of disorder that they're trying to fight. The Chinese don't see it that way. The Chinese don't start with the notion of rights, they start with the notion of common good. In their common good, then, it's very, very important that the common good is protected. But there are no individual rights. That's why it's so difficult for Westerners to make any headway when they try to talk about human rights in China. I don't talk about the government. All of the ordinary citizens I've met are inherently uncomfortable with the statement about human rights as individual rights, fearing that these rights will interfere with the common good. Well, if the Chinese have this notion of a common good, how do they see the common good coming about? How do they see harmony promoted? I've already discussed that the notion of hierarchy is very critical to one form of harmony that the Chinese believe can be maintained. But there's more to it than that. The Chinese see harmony as being produced as the result of education. Now, this form of harmony is particularly Confucian. So some other schools of Chinese traditional thought are less, adhere to this less clearly. But for the Confucians, you promote harmony through hierarchy that has reciprocity, so that those who are in higher positions have to take care of lower positions. But you also do it through education. So let's take a look at Confucian logic as it's applied to the problem of maintaining public order. Now, for this I'm going to read a section of the Analects that has been widely quoted, and this is a particular translation, so you may hear other translations that vary slightly. But here it is. This is from The Great Learning, and it's reprinted in a number of places. The ancients who wished to illustrate illustrious virtue throughout the kingdom first ordered well their own states. Wishing to order well their own states, they first regulated their families. Wishing to regulate their families, they first cultivated their persons. Wishing to cultivate their persons, they first rectified their hearts. Wishing to rectify their hearts, they first sought to be sincere in their thoughts. Wishing to be sincere in their thoughts, they first extended to the utmost their knowledge. Such extension of knowledge lay in the investigation of things. Things being investigated, knowledge became complete. Their knowledge being complete, their thoughts were sincere. Their thoughts being sincere, their hearts were rectified. Their hearts being rectified, their persons were cultivated. Their persons being cultivated, their families were regulated. Their families being regulated, their states were rightly governed. The whole kingdom was made tranquil and happy. This is a classic case of Confucian logic, and it centers on education. So education becomes very critical. Many manifestations in Chinese culture are reflected in this kind of statement. It's widely noted that Confucius changed the notion of what it meant to be a gentleman, or what it meant to be an aristocrat, from someone of high birth, perhaps the son of military leaders who inherited their rights. He changed all that to those who were aristocratic, or those who were gentlemen, were also gentlemen scholars. And what made them gentlemen, what made them aristocrats, was the very fact that they had education. Education was said to be valuable for everyone. No matter what their position in the hierarchy, they could be educated to do the right thing for the position that they had. This tells us how important education is. But it leaves a question hanging. What do you do if you have people who don't educate very well? What do you do if you have people who are just too dull, too stupid, or too evil to follow the education? Now, Confucius doesn't like to talk about these cases because that harms this kind of educational model that he thinks is so very important. And he does think that virtually every Chinese can be educated and should be educated in one way or another to fulfill the proper role and to promote a harmonious society. And that's what Confucius would like to say. But Confucius and the followers of Confucius have to acknowledge that some people just don't get it. Some people indeed may be too evil to get it. And what do you do in those cases? Well, in those cases, I'll tell you what you don't do. You don't have an 8th Amendment in the Bill of Rights that says no cruel and unusual punishment. On the contrary, you say, well, if you want people to conform, and they just won't conform if they just refuse to be educated, the harshest possible penalties have to be imposed. And therefore, of course you'll torture them. There's a saying that's sometimes heard, he's too good for killing. And what they mean is, not that he is some terrible criminal who's done something so awful that killing seems somehow to be too easy for him. This is a Western phrase. The Chinese understand it very well. If they think if somebody is so evil, so terrible, that they would commit murder, or that they would commit, say, parricide, killing a parent, killing a father in particular, if there's somebody who just doesn't get it, we're going to give them the harshest possible penalties. And therefore the Chinese are famous or infamous, if you like, in the study of world criminology for all of these terrible penalties. Death by 1,000 cuts, Chinese water torture, all kinds of really hideous punishments that go way beyond the requirements of, say, capital punishment. Now, the Chinese get a bad name for this, but understand that they mean to use these only for the smallest possible cases. And they think that by having utterly horrible penalties, most people will figure out that they must not do those terrible, bad, and evil things. It doesn't always work. But over 2,000 years, the Chinese would argue that that has worked more often than not, giving them a stable traditional system for a longer period of time than most other nations, most other civilizations can boast. Indeed, they have the longest continuous history with the smallest amount of disorder. But they do have disorder, and the disorder I will deal with in another lecture. What is the origin of the kind of disorder that they think exists? Now, let's do another comparison. So we have, on the one hand, the Western commitment based in rights, individual rights of self-preservation, based on the law of self-preservation. This produces rights, rights to a fair trial, rights to no cruel and unusual punishment, rights to be let out on bond. These rights the Chinese think are strange. If you have people who are terribly criminal, why would you want to treat them well? You want to treat them harshly so that the vast majority of the people learn not to behave in that way. I'm not going to do a brief for Confucianism on this point, or any of the other points. I'm just trying to explain how it works. But let me give you another of the consequences of this kind of thinking on the part of the Chinese. For all the Chinese talk about education as it flows out of the thinking of Confucianism, there's another very real truth. The Chinese government has always had an overwhelming a large army, sometimes overwhelmingly large, in order to maintain internal order and in order to deter enemies from abroad. It has been characteristic of the Chinese to have a very large army. At the same time, it's characteristic for the Confucians to not respect the army very much. What is the army filled with? Well, it's never filled with the firstborn sons of aristocrats. They all think that having a son who could be a potential scholar or official would mean that you'd be utterly wasting them. You'd be making cannon fodder out of the best of the Chinese. So the army positions, the military positions, are never high. You can look at other societies. Look at medieval Europe, where to be a knight is to be a great, great honor. Or look at Japanese society, where to be a samurai is to be a great, great honor. Or to look at the hierarchy that you find in Hindu culture, which has the military leaders close to the top. They're never the top, but they're close to the top. Not so the Chinese. The Chinese are far down at the bottom. So the Chinese are committed to very large armies. Even in the 21st century, we find that the Chinese remain committed to a large number of people under arms. Sometimes this has been a virtue that's come out of necessity. So there were times, for example, in the Korean War, when they had a huge army, they would send 3 million up against a much smaller American force and would face staggering casualties. In the Korean War, the Chinese sent their army into the field with 1 rifle for every 10 men. How did they expect them to fight? Well, they expected when the first guy died, the second guy would pick up his rifle and shoot with it. And when the second guy died, the third would, and so on and so forth. Human wave activities. Not very productive, the Chinese have learned, for a real first-class fighting force, and therefore all the attempts at modernization in the current Chinese army. But underlying it is a belief that you need a large manpower. And where does this work especially well? The large Chinese manpower works very well in deterring internal disorder. Internal disorder is kept at a minimum, and therefore harmony is promoted by the presence of a very large military force. Not always well equipped, but of course it doesn't have to be well equipped if they are facing a populace that is not armed themselves, which brings me to another of the comparisons. You can look in the Chinese Constitution and you will not find a Second Amendment right to bear arms or anything close to it, because that would fly in the face of their belief about the need to maintain order in order to fight off Luan. Again, not making a brief for either side here, just trying to explain how the logic works for both sides. Now there is another factor here that's worth describing, and that's the other factor that leads to what kind of political power do you have. In the West, particularly in the logic that I've been giving you from British and American statements of rights and so on, there is a notion that there is a rule of law. So the rule of law protects the rights of self-preservation. It gives us a government that can use the rule of law in order to stop disorders. The rule of law then becomes a highly important factor in protecting rights. So the rule of law is absolutely vital. And the rule of law is typified in the West, particularly in the American Constitution, by the requirement that every person who holds office has to take an oath of office. Nothing like this will be found in China, because there the rule of man in the form of the ruler is the primary characteristic. How did we do?
That was it. That's 1437.